Are you a metal guitarist who enjoys writing riffs and songs, but also feels confused or intimidated by music theory? Do you not know where to start with music theory? If that is the case, then you are in the right place. Hi, this is Rick Galvez, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to help you reach your fullest musical potential as guitarists and songwriters. Knowing music theory will only make you a better musician, as well as enhance your creativity. Scales, chords, and chord progressions are often associated with music theory. But before we can dive into those topics, we need to understand the most fundamental building blocks of musical harmony. This fundamental element of music that I am talking about is none other than intervals. You may be asking yourself, what is an interval? At its most fundamental level, an interval is the distance between two musical notes. Each interval comes with its own characteristic sound, and they are also the basis behind the building of chords and scales. Intervals are important to know because they help you understand music on a deeper level. They are what will help you make sense of chords and scales, which can often seem confusing and intimidating to those unfamiliar with music theory. By getting to know intervals, you can get to know the patterns behind scale shapes and chords, which means you won't have to rely on remembering scale patterns all across the fretboard, which can seem intimidating and overwhelming. An easy way to get to know intervals is to correspond them to the amount of frets away it is from a root note. Have a look at this chart, which neatly lays out each interval and how many frets away it is from the root. Hit the pause button if you need to. Let's get to know the intervals with the guitar and see how they sound. So let's start with our low E note as our root. If we go up one fret, so one semitone, we get to the note F. That is our minor second interval. Very common interval in metal. Next up, we got our major second, which sounds like this. So from there, I just went up one whole step or two semitones up from the root. Definitely not as dark as a sound as the minor second, but still a very common interval found in metal, rock, and music in general, just because it's found in so many common scales, like natural minor, harmonic minor, Hungarian minor, all sorts of scales. Next one up is also never very common interval in metal and rock music. That's the minor third. So I was just going up three semitones from the root. So from E to G. So from the low E up to the third fret of the low E string. And that interval is very common in a lot of scales that are used in metal, like Phrygian, natural minor, harmonic minor, Hungarian minor, diminished especially. It's pretty much all over diminished. Okay, next scale. Sorry, not next scale. The next interval is the major third. So that's just going up again another semitone. So now we got the low E going to the fourth fret of the low E string. So that's two full steps or four half steps. However you want to think about it. That's a very common interval used in a lot of major scales, like the Ionian mode, Lydian mode, Mixolydian, even in Phrygian dominant, which is still a fairly commonly used scale in metal as well. So you definitely don't want to neglect the major intervals because they will play, a role eventually. Even in a type of music like metal, you'll still find them. Okay, so next up we got our perfect fourth. Next interval is our perfect fourth. That definitely has a more ambiguous sound. It's not necessarily major or minor or anything really close. So for that reason, it ends up being a really good transitionary interval to bridge between more melodically interesting intervals, such as, like your major and minor thirds, your perfect fifths, sixths, etc. Next up is the most commonly associated interval in metal music, and that's none other than the tritone, or also known as the diminished fifth or augmented fourth. More on the use of multiple names for a note coming up later in this video. Anyway, so here's how a tritone sounds. Very great sound to use in metal music. Next up, we got our perfect fifth. Not nearly as dark as our flattened fifth, but still an extremely crucial interval to use in metal. Still a very crucial interval to use in metal. And the reason for that being is because our power chords that this type of music is based off of is consisting of the root and the perfect fifth. So for example, next up we have our minor sixth, which sounds like this. Another fairly tense sounding interval that is very commonly found in a lot of scales used in metal, like the aforementioned natural minor, Phrygian, harmonic minor, as well as many others as well out there. But yeah, that's also an excellent sound to incorporate into metal music too. Next up, we have our major sixth, which sounds like this. Definitely a brighter sound than our minor sixth, but in music in general, it's still a very applicable interval to use for sure. Next up, we have our minor seventh, which sounds like this. Then we have our major seventh, which sounds like this. So a more tense version of our minor seventh. And then last but not least, we have a full octave. It's important to note that intervals can be played in two different ways. An interval can be played as a melodic interval, which means that two notes are played separately one after the other. For example, a lot of single note tremolo picking riffs are common. A lot of black metal and death metal fall under this category. An example of this would be the well-known riff from the song Freezing Moon by Mayhem. Intervals can also be played as harmonic intervals, which means the notes that make up the interval are played at the same time. The most common chord in metal, rock, and punk music is a harmonic interval, and that is none other than the power chord, which consists of the root and a perfect fifth. Other harmonic intervals are common in metal music as well. These are commonly referred to as dyads, which means two-note chords. For example, minor third and major third dyads are quite common. More on these dyads soon. For now, here is an example of a metal riff that uses a lot of harmonic intervals. You might recognize this one from the Metallica song Orion. There are also a lot of great riffs out there that use both melodic and harmonic intervals. An example of which is the opening riff, The Soul Reaper, by Dissection. The next step to getting to know the intervals is by distinguishing them by their quantity and their quality. Intervals are broken down into predominantly their major and minor counterparts, ranging from the numbers 1 through 7. This isn't the case with fourths and fifths though. Those are referred to as perfect, diminished, and augmented. The quality of the interval is determined by whether it is a major, minor, perfect, diminished, or augmented interval. As just previously stated, the fourths and fifths are the intervals that can be labeled as perfect, diminished, or augmented. The perfect fourth and fifth intervals are the most constant ones, especially the perfect fifth, which is why they are labeled as perfect. Diminished in this context refers to lowering the interval by a semitone, whereas augmented refers to raising the interval by a semitone. For example, if you raise a perfect fourth interval by a semitone, then you have an augmented fourth. Lowering a perfect fifth by a semitone results in a diminished fifth. Both of these are also commonly referred to as a tritone or the devil's interval. As you probably just noticed, these examples are literally the same interval but with two different names. That brings me to my next important point about intervals, and that is the concept of enharmonically equivalent intervals. A sharp and B flat are enharmonically equivalent intervals. So are D sharp and E flat. Augmented fifths and minor sixths as well. They are the same note, but with different names. You might be asking yourself, does it even matter which name of the two I use when naming a note? It's not 100% necessary, but I would argue that to an extent it's helpful to use a particular name when naming a note. For example, if you're playing a scale that has at least one sharp or flat, let's take the E natural minor scale for example. Starting from a root note E, we have the intervallic formula of root, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, minor seventh, and then our full octave. We could call our major second interval a G flat, but since we already have a G natural as our minor third, it makes more sense to call the major second interval an F sharp instead. This way we can say we have an E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, and D in the E natural minor scale. It takes advantage of all the quantities of interval names and makes the formula clearer to understand with the use of just one quantity per interval. If you want to go above and beyond and learn how to read music notation, then it's beneficial to be mindful of which note you use for a particular interval in a piece of music. It will make reading the sheet music clearer by using different enharmonic interval names. For example, if you're playing in the key of D minor, you will be using the note B flat instead of an A sharp, since we already have an A natural note in the key. This again will make the notes on the staff clearer for whatever piece of music you are working on. You might not care about learning how to read music notation, and as a metal or rock guitarist, that's totally fine. But if you want to get into writing for other instruments such as piano, woodwinds, brass, etc., then learning musical notation is totally necessary. Some styles of metal use instruments beyond just guitar, bass, and drums after all. If you want to delve into classical guitar playing, then it's also crucial to be able to read musical notation as well. Intervals aren't just limited to notes within one octave, which are called simple intervals. Intervals that extend past a full octave are called compound intervals. Common compound intervals include ninths, 11ths, 13ths, etc. You might be totally perplexed by these compound intervals, but trust me, they aren't nearly as hard to understand as you may think. Start off by taking one of the simple intervals that we have discussed before, such as the second, third, fourth, etc., and simply add 7 to it. Compound intervals are really just the same as simple intervals, except that they are a whole octave higher than their simple interval counterparts. The same concept of interval qualities as previously discussed applies to compound intervals as well. There are major and minor ninths, natural and augmented 11ths, minor and major 13ths, etc. The Malice Divine song In Time is an excellent example of using compound intervals in a song. In this riff, there are multiple uses of minor and major tenths, which are thirds an octave higher. By understanding intervals, you will be able to create both tension and resolution in your songwriting. An example of this will be creating tension with more distant intervals such as the minor second or minor sixth, and then resolving to much more constant intervals such as a perfect octave or a perfect fifth. That's all for now, folks. Let me know what you think about today's video in the comments below. If you want hands-on experience with the application of music theory into your guitar playing, then be sure to hit me up for private guitar lessons on my website, or by email or on DM via social media. Next up, we will be discussing the best scales that you can use in your metal riffs, songwriting, and soloing. Cheers everyone, and I will see you in the next video.